I sat bolt upright, jolted by Jess's panic-stricken voice. Max. Tyler's gone. My head tried to understand what she was saying as I struggled out of the tent, morning light stretching out the shadows at our campsite. Tyler's tent was empty, his sleeping bag flung open, and his boots gone. My first thought was that he'd wandered off for one of his infamous pranks. But Jess's expression told me this was different. Did he say anything last night? I asked, turning toward the nearby trees half expecting that at any moment Tyler would pop out from behind one with his characteristic grin. He didn't. It was just the woods around us, silent and still, their heaviness unsettling. Ella joined us, bleary-eyed for a moment until she picked up on our tension. "Where's Tyler?" she frowned. "That's what we're trying to figure out," Jess replied, her tone tight with worry. I huddled behind Tyler's tent, observing a faint trail of footsteps leading from camp into the woods. It was something about the way the tracks veered off that felt off. They weren't just wandering footsteps, they were almost purposeful, as if he'd been drawn to something. "We should follow his tracks," I ventured with a growing sense of unease tickling my spine. Jess hesitated. "Max, you remember last night, right? The lights?" "The lights." I could feel a shiver run down my spine as I thought of the strange light we'd seen deep in the woods, flickering like a fire from far away. We'd convinced ourselves it was fireflies or a campfire off in the distance, but with Tyler now gone, it didn't seem like a coincidence anymore. "Let's just find him," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "I'm sure he's just playing around. Somewhere." Ella looked unconvinced, but she nodded and we started off, following Tyler's trail into the trees. The forest felt denser than it had yesterday. The air was heavy and thick, muffling our footsteps. The deeper we went, the darker it got, even though it was still early morning. Jess walked beside me, her eyes darting around, tension palpable in every line of her body. "I've got a bad feeling about this, Max. It's like, the woods don't want us here." I laughed forced, and tried to ease off the unease creeping up on all of us. "Come on, Jess. It's just a forest. Tyler probably just went exploring." But as I spoke it, the same odd sensation came over me. A weight upon us, a presence, something waiting close at hand, just out of sight. It was as if the trees themselves could hear, were listening. After what felt like an eternity, we arrived at a small clearing. There, Tyler's footprints simply ended in mid-stride, as if he had vanished into nothingness. We called his name, but our voices were swallowed by the heavy silence of the woods. Then, from somewhere in the distance, came a faint glow, the same eerie light we'd seen last night. Flickering between the trees, pulsing gently, it was like a beacon, calling us deeper into the forest. Ella grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "Max, do you see that? The light." "I see it," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Jess was staring from me to the light, her face pale. What if Tyler went toward it? The thought sent a shiver of terror running through me. We should have turned around then, gone back to the main road and called for help. But something in that light drew me in, a pull I couldn't explain, an invitation in silence. We went against our better judgment and inched closer to the glow, deeper into the unknown. The light pulsed far off, thin but fascinating. It was as if with every step we made toward it, it became heavier, like the forest was trying to hold us back. Jess clung to my arm, her hand clammy against my skin, while Ella trailed closely behind, her eyes wide with fear. "Max, we really should turn around," Jess whispered, her voice shaking. "This feels wrong." She was right. Everything about this felt wrong. But Tyler was out there, and the trail we'd been following had led us directly to this eerie glow. Turning back now didn't feel like an option. I took a deep breath and nodded. "Just a little further. If we don't see him soon, we'll head back." The closer we got to the source of the light, the more it felt like the trees were closing in around us, their branches tangling overhead like skeletal fingers. I began to feel my chest start to pressurize uncomfortably, as if the chill in the air was getting heavier. Every shred of instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of there, but something else, curiosity, the need to find Tyler, continued to drive me forward. Finally, we emerged into a small clearing, and there it was. The light emanated from some sort of circle on the ground, glowing dimly in a pale blue color. It resembled perhaps fireflies, or some other bioluminescent moss, scattered in a very near-perfect circle. "What is that?" Ella whispered, almost inaudibly. I shook my head. "I have no idea. But I think Tyler must have seen it too." The three of us stared at the circle, an eerie feeling settling over us. Jess glanced around, peering toward the dark trees surrounding us. "Max. I don't think we're alone here." As soon as she said it, I felt it too, a sensation, like someone, or something, was watching us from the shadows. I turned, straining to see past the trees, but there was only darkness. Then, out of the blue, there was a soft rustling noise behind us. We spun around, hearts racing, and there was nothing. The noise got louder and began to circle us as if we were being enveloped by figures we couldn't see shifting through the underbrush. "Tyler?" I called out, my voice echoing into the silence. No answer. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the clearing, carrying on it the faintest whisper, soft, yet enough to send a shiver down my spine. Jess's grip on my arm tightened, her face had gone pale. "We need to go, Max. Now." "Wait." Ella's voice was barely above a whisper, her gaze fixed on something just beyond the circle. She pointed and I followed her line of sight. There, across the clearing, partially obscured by the shadow, stood a figure. At first, I thought it could have been Tyler, but as my eyes adjusted, I knew it was taller and thinner than any human, and wrong. The figure didn't move, its face was shrouded in shadow, yet I knew it was staring at us with an unnatural stillness. "Max," Jess breathed, pulling on my arm. "We gotta go." But I was rooted to the spot. It was as if my legs had sprouted roots, like the circle itself was sticking me there. The figure moved forward in a slow and deliberate motion. The light around us flickered and eerie shadows danced across, twisting and stretching. I yelled out, "Tyler." More in desperation than in hope. The figure did not respond, it just moved closer and took shape, a tall, gangly figure with hollow eyes that seemed to drink in the darkness around it. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It cocked its head in a near curiosity before melting back into the shadows, gone as if it had never existed. Mute, the three of us just stood there as the weight of the silence hung over us, until finally Jess spoke up, "Max, please, we need to get out of here." I nodded, forcing myself, my heart was pounding. "Yeah. Let's go." We began to turn and leave, but in those steps backward into the forest, my stomach did that sickening drop as I realized with a surge of panic that I didn't have any idea which direction we'd come from. All the trees were similar, towering shadows that seemed to close in around us, shutting out any hint of the path we'd taken. "Wait," I said, trying to sound steady. "Does anyone remember the way back?" Jess looked around, her face stricken. I thought it was this way, but..." She trailed off, her voice shaking. Ella stared at the ground, her hands shaking. Neen, it was that way. I'm sure of it." But as we turned in that direction, trees seemed to shift and rearrange themselves, the path disappearing before our very eyes. I panicked then and tried to recall the map, the landmarks we'd passed, anything to take us back. But it had altered, the woods had swallowed up any semblance of familiarity. "We're lost," Jess whispered, the reality hitting home. "Let's just keep moving," I said, trying to sound much more confident than I was. "We'll find the trail eventually. We just need to keep going." We pushed forward, stumbling through the underbrush and calling out Tyler's name, but our voices sounded hollow, swallowed by the dense silence. The deeper we went into the forest, the more it seemed to change, the trees growing thicker, their twisted branches forming a dark canopy that blotted out the sky. After what felt like hours, we reached another small clearing, nearly undistinguishable from the last one we'd crossed. A chill dread washed over me as I recognized that faint glow on the ground, the same circle of light we'd seen all those hours before. No. Jess's voice shook. We're back where we started. It didn't make any sense. We had been walking in the opposite direction, putting as much distance between ourselves and that circle as possible. But here we were, standing in the same spot, faint light casting eerie shadows across our faces. Ella began to cry softly, her shoulders shaking. We're never getting out of here, are we? Don't say that, I said, though my own fear was clawing its way to the surface. We took a wrong turn. That's all. But as I looked around, there was no avoiding the truth, we weren't just lost. We were being led back, in, drawn and kept near that circle of light. This time, the silence was broken by a rustling sound louder and all around us. I whirled, my heart racing with growing fear, as shadows shifted and took shapes that appeared to press against us. Jess squeezed my hand, her grasp tight. Max, I don't think we're alone here. Those words hung in the air, and in that moment, I knew she was right. The forest wasn't just a place, it was alive, watching us, guiding us, with a purpose all its own. We had come here looking for Tyler. But right now, standing in the heart of Red Falls Forest, I wasn't so sure any of us would leave. The oppressive silence of the forest was almost palpable, a thick fog that leaned upon us. I fought for clarity, for the clearing of my mind, but the sense of being watched gnawed at me, twisting my thoughts. Others huddled close, all of us stared at the eerie glow, pulsating soft from the circle on the ground. It felt as though the light were alive, breathing to a rhythm that echoed deep within the forest. We should get out of here, Jess whispered, though she didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the circle, drawn to it despite her fear. Which way? Ella asked, her voice breaking. She was shaking more visibly now, her arms clutched to her as though holding herself in. I scanned the trees, but it was like the forest had swallowed any familiar landmarks so that every direction looked exactly alike. It sank in, whatever path we'd taken was gone, and the forest itself seemed intent on keeping it that way. We'll go back, I said, forcing myself to sound calm. We just have to keep track of the light so we don't end up back here. I began to usher them away, but after only a few feet of walking, a weird noise resounded from our behinds, a soft humming noise very far away, almost like chanting. I ceased walking, trying to listen hard, but it had disappeared as quickly as it appeared. Did you guys hear that? Jess asked, her face as pale as I felt. Probably just the wind, I lied, trying to disregard the prickle of fear inching up my spine. Yet I knew, deep inside, something was unnatural about that sound. We were getting deeper in, and it seemed as though the forest closed in even tighter. Above, branches arched overhead in twisted and gnarled forms that almost reached faces. Shadows danced in my peripheral vision, yet when I turned, they vanished, omitting themselves into the darkness. We walked for hours, or at least it felt like we walked for hours, but the forest didn't let out a hint of a clear exit. Jess started marking trees with her pocket knife, tiny scratches through the bark to keep count of our direction. But no matter how far we walked, that glowing circle would show and show, always dragging us back in. Somewhere along the line, Ella froze, staring at the ground. Max, look. I followed her gaze, my heart fell. There in the dirt were our footprints, loops of them, overlapping, leading us in endless circles. Jess's marks on the trees confirmed it. We hadn't moved forward at all. The forest was leading us in circles, bringing us back to the same cursed spot over and over. This can't be, Jess whispered, turning around, face-stricken. How is this possible? My head spun as it tried to make sense of anything. Before I could reply, that low hum continued, this time louder, like voices chanting in unison. with no apparent meaning behind the syllables yet somehow hauntingly familiar in the currentness of the air. "Max," Jess whispered, digging her fingers into my arm. "Do you see that?" I turned, and there, just beyond the trees, was the figure again, the same tall, shadowed form we'd seen before. It stood perfectly still, watching us with those hollow, unblinking eyes. My breath caught in my throat as it took a step forward, then another, gliding soundlessly over the forest floor. Ella whimpered, backing away, her gaze fixed on the figure. "It's coming closer." The figure paused, cocking its head a little, as if considering us. Then, as if it reached a conclusion, it held up one hand and pointed back toward the glowing circle. "What does it want?" Jess whispered, her voice hushed. "I don't know," I lied, trying to sound steady. But an awful thought was already working its way into my mind, one that I couldn't budge. Maybe it's trying to lead us somewhere," I said, the words sounding ridiculous even as they left my lips. Jess stared at me, incredulous and fearful. "You want us to follow it?" "We're not getting out on our own," I said, unable to mask desperation in my voice. "Whatever this thing is, it knows this forest. It knows where it's taking us." Ella shook her head, backing away. "No. No way. I'm not following that thing. We need to get out of here, Max. Please." But as she spoke, the figure shifted again, was gone into the trees, leaving behind only the soft glow of the circle. The chanting grew louder then, echoing through the woods, and I felt a strange compulsion, a pull, like the light drawing me in, urging me forward. "Max, wait." The voice of Jess cut through my trance and plopped me back into reality. But I was beyond recall. I had already stepped through into the circle. The instant my foot touched the glowing ring, the chanting stopped and there was dead silence. A fierce brilliance flared, blinding me, and for a moment, it was as though I were falling, sinking into the earth, into the very heart of the forest. By the time my vision had cleared, I was still standing within the circle, but everything was now different. The trees were tall, with their branches twisting and curving into unnatural shapes, their bark was carved with weird symbols that pulsed with an uncanny blue glow. Jess and Ella were standing outside the circle. Terror was etched upon their faces. "Max, what's happening?" Jess's voice was barely above a whisper, as if she was scared of speaking too loud. "I don't know," I said, my voice distant even to me. Yet down deep, I did a presence in the woods, the very ground beneath my feet alive, aware, watching. Then I saw him. Tyler. Standing at the edge of the clearing, his face pale and expressionless, his eyes blank, almost as if he was sleepwalking. He took one step forward, then another, moving toward us in a slow, mechanical way. "Tyler!" I shouted, feeling suddenly washed up in a wave of relief. But he didn't respond. Just kept on walking, stiff, almost robotic. Jess gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Max, something's wrong. He's not himself." The chanting started again, softly at first but louder, more insistent, echoing from all sides. Tyler stopped just outside the circle, his blank eyes staring straight ahead, unseeing as if he were in some kind of trance. "Tyler!" I screamed again, the second time taking a step towards him and yet was abruptly halted as weight held me back suddenly. The forest seemed to be clutching at me, holding on and not letting go. Jess and Ella both tugged at my arms now, desperately trying to pull me from the circle, but it was no use. I was stuck tied to this glowing ring by some unseen force. And then, Tyler spoke. "The forest has chosen," he said, the hollowness of his voice, empty, an echo with a strange, otherworldly timbre. "It remembers all who enter." The chanting grew louder, relentless rhythm pounding in my ears, filling me with a terror I couldn't describe. Jess and Ella screamed, yanking at me, but the force held tight, refusing to let me leave. And then a chill ran down my spine as his face contorted into that chilling smile, and I knew with dawning horror what the forest had all along been trying to tell us. We weren't visitors. We were offerings. The chanting increased in my ears, every word boomed in my ears to the time of my heartbeat, loud and overwhelming, until trees appeared inside my head. The desperate screams of Jess and Ella sounded far away, muffled where I was moving further and further from them. The glow of the circle brightened till everything else faded. It ceased as suddenly as it had begun. There was a thick, heavy layer of silence fallen over us, like a velvet curtain, disturbed only by the faint sound of my own ragged breathing. The glow around the circle died away and the unseen vice which had held me where I had been placed relaxed. With my heart racing, I managed to stumble backward as Jess caught my arm. "Max, are you okay?" Her voice shook, her face was etched in terror. I nodded, but was far from convinced it was so. It was as if something had shifted and a part of me was still connected to that weird, pulsating energy in the circle. The woods around us were darker now, it seemed, the trees closer, their limbs curved, twisted in ways unnatural. Ella stared, horror-stricken at Tyler, who stood just beyond the circle, his eyes open and unblinking, his face expressionless, like an empty shell. "Tyler," I said quietly, taking a cautious step towards him. There was no greeting. He turned rigidly then, with jerky movements, as if his body worked on strings. Then he disappeared into the trees until his figure became swallowed up by the darkness. "Wait!" I called, moving to follow him, but Jess grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "Max, don't," she pleaded. Whatever that was, it isn't Tyler. Not anymore." But I couldn't shake the image of my best friend disappearing into the darkness. "We can't just leave him," I said, my voice desperate. She stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "If we don't leave now, we might never get out. You felt it, didn't you, Max? The forest, it's alive, and it wants us." It was the truth of her words that hit home, but I just couldn't turn my back on Tyler. "We go after him," I returned with conviction, while fear clawed in my belly. "If there's even a chance he's still himself, we can't just leave him here." Jess and Ella looked at each other but then, after a moment of pulled brows, nodded. The three of us stepped out of the circle, following the faint path Tyler had taken. The deeper we walked into the forest, the colder it got, the metallic scent hanging in the air clings to the back of my throat. Every step felt wrong, like the ground itself was pushing back, resisting our movement. Shadows danced between trees flickering at the edges of our vision and the faint whispers of the chanting returned, barely audible, like a haunting memory. "Max," Jess whispered, clinging to my arm. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I wasn't. But something, maybe desperation, maybe a compulsion I couldn't explain, drove me forward. Tyler's figure was barely visible ahead, a dark silhouette moving slowly, purposefully, as if he were leading us somewhere. The trees thinned as we approached a steep ravine, the ground dropping off abruptly. At the edge of the cliff, Tyler stood, facing away from us, his posture eerily still. Beyond him, a vast expanse of forest stretched out, illuminated by the faint glow of a hidden moon. "Tyler!" I called, my voice breaking the silence. He didn't respond. Instead, he took another step forward, his foot over the edge of the ravine. A wave of panic rushed through me, and I sprang forward, catching his arm just as he was beginning to fall. His head turned, his face inches from mine, and for the first time, I saw the emptiness in his eyes, a chasm, dark and unfathomable, like staring into the abyss. His mouth parted, and he let out one word, a whisper so soft I could hardly hear it. "Run." I felt the word hang in the air, its terror chilling me to the core. And in one final, illogical display of strength, Tyler reached out and shoved me backward. Stumbling, I fell into Jess and Ella. We crumpled to the ground in a heap, scrambling to our feet to watch in horror as Tyler stepped off the edge, his figure disappearing into the inky blackness below. "No!" I screamed, the sound reverberating into the open. Jess grasped my arm and pulled me back, her face white. Max, we have to go. Now. But I was immobile. My legs seemed rooted in the dirt as I stared at the nothing that had swallowed Tyler up. Not until Ella tugged on my arm, her voice trembling with fear, did I turn. The whispers grew louder, congealing into a unified chant of voices that emanated from everywhere in all directions as we stumbled backwards into the trees. It was as if the very forest seemed to close in on us, its reaching branches like skeletal hands brushing against our skin as we ran. It seemed that at every turn, we were enveloped by the presence of the forest around us. It watched and waited and savored. The air began to grow heavy and claustrophobic, breathing becoming a labor, and the earth started to slant around us, carrying us deeper into the heart of the woods. "We're walking in circles," Jess panted, the edge of panic lacing her voice. "Max, we aren't going to get out. We're going deeper." The weight of truth in her words settled upon me. Whichever way we turned, the woods twisted and shifted, always returning us to that very same cursed path. It seemed the trees themselves were shifting, readjusting to maintain us in the clutches of the forest. We finally collapsed into another clearing, our breathing ragged, our legs shaking with exhaustion. In the center of the glade stood an ancient stone altar smothered in moss, its surface worn smooth by the constant wear of time. Groggy symbols were carved into the stone, faintly glowing with the same eerie light we had seen in the circle. It was louder then, filling the air, and a wave of dread washed over me. This place was different, older, filled with an energy that became darker, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. "We shouldn't be here," Ella whispered, her voice barely audible. This is where they bring their offerings." "Offerings?" I repeated, my mind racing. The word brought an unsettling realization along with it. The forest didn't just trap people, it consumed them. A shadow moved at the edge of the clearing, and I spun, heart racing. It was Tyler's form that materialized from behind the trees, his face expressionless, his eyes empty, just like before. But this time, he wasn't alone. Figures stood behind him, dozens of them, wavering forms just like shadows, each silent and still. "Run," he whispered again, lost in the chorus of chanting. But the forest didn't let that happen this time. The shadows pounced upon us, wrapped themselves around us, and though their faces were indeed cloaked, their eyes stared with hunger in them sharper than any curiosity could have. I felt them weighing upon us, an unspoken compulsion that seemed to shut all avenues of escape. The altar began to pulse brighter, an eerie blue light sent dancing through the clearing. I felt it again, the pull of a force on me, drawing me toward the stone. Stronger this time, impossible to resist. Jess and Ella clung to my arms, but their strength was no match for that of the forest's will. The last thing I heard was Jess's scream, piercing the darkness, as the light enveloped me, dragging me into the very heart of the forest's primeval and malevolent power. The light faded, leaving me standing alone in the clearing. Jess and Ella were gone. The trees around me felt impossibly close, their branches curling toward me like fingers, blocking out all light except for the faint glow of the stone altar. My heartbeat thundered in my chest, with a growing sense of dread with each beat. The clearing was silent now, the chanting gone but replaced with a heavy, suffocating quiet that made my skin crawl. I felt a prickle at the back of my neck, a sensation that something or someone was watching me. "Jess?" I called out, my voice echoing in the emptiness. Nothing. I spun around, wild-eyed, my mind racing. But whatever way I turned, the forest was still, its shadows deepening, as if closing in on me. Then, at the very edge of my vision, I saw them, figures emerging slowly from the dark, their shapes barely distinguishable against the night. They moved without sound, their eyes were hollow, faces indistinguishable, like specters called out of the forest itself. And in the middle of them was Tyler. He stepped forward, his face blank, completely without recognition. The same twisted smile I'd seen before crossed his lips, and he raised a single finger to point at the altar. The implication was unmistakable. An offering. "Tyler, please," I whispered, my voice shaking. You don't have to do this. We can still get out. We can. The words choked in my throat as his face changed, that vacant smile contorting into something harder, almost malevolent. He took a backward step, disappeared into the ranks of shadows, and for one flashing instant, I might have thought I saw another something stand in his place, an ancient, hooded form, its eyes aglow with an awareness older by far than humankind. Then, behind me, I heard Jess's voice. Faint, strained, as if from a distance. Max, help me. I spun around, the sound slicing through the silence, and I felt a surge of hope. Jess! Where are you? Please, help me. The voice reverberated among the trees, each word farther away. I panicked and launched myself at the sound, hardly feeling it when the shadows closed in around me. Every step twisting and changing, deeper into the forest, until finally I burst into a smaller clearing. There she was. Jess, standing by another altar, her face pale, her body trembling. Ella was beside her, staring at me with wide, fearful eyes. Relief engulfed me as I surged forward, reaching out to pull them both away from the stone. But then I approached, and I saw the truth. Jess's hands were bound with thick vines to the altar, coarse against her skin. The symbols on the stone started to glow brighter, illuminating her face with an unnatural light. Her eyes met mine, mirrored with fear and acceptance. Max, she whispered, her voice breaking. It's too late. No, I insisted, grabbing the vines, pulling with all my strength. We're getting out of here. All of us. Ella took a step back, her face pale, like she had seen something I hadn't. Max. I don't think we are supposed to go anywhere. Those words hung in the air, and with them came a presence of the forest pressing down on me, heavier than any weight that I could struggle against. The tenebrousness around us grew even deeper, and the air thickened with an unseen heft that suddenly pulsed to the cadence of the glowing symbols across the altar. Please. Jess whispered, shaking. Don't let it take me. Desperation clawed at me, and I yanked at vines with all my might, but they wouldn't budge. They were alive, tightening with every pull, digging deeper into her skin, as if the forest itself was claiming her. Then I felt it, the demand of the forest. An ancient, unyielding presence pressed into my mind, washing me with images of the many others that had stood where we stood now. The same terror, the same pleading, the same end. The forest didn't just take, it consumed, binding us to its twisted purpose. The chanting was going again, soft at first, then louder, swelling the air with a dark, hungry energy. Jess's eyes went wide, her breath catching in shallow gasps, and I could feel her fear, her understanding that this was it. Max, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. You have to go. Save yourself. I cannot leave you, I said, my voice breaking. But deep in my heart, I knew the truth. The forest had chosen, and it would not let all of us go. The presence leaned harder, an unspoken command pulsating in my mind, a single, unavoidable choice. It wanted an offering, one life tied to this forest, one that was going to stay here for eternity, so that its power should never be broken. She turned to me then, her face gentling, and for one instant I saw in her features the girl I loved, the one who'd come on this trip for me, trusting me to keep her safe. She nodded once, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but in that second I knew what she wanted me to do. I love you, she whispered, a heartbreaking calm in her tone. But you need to live. The trees seemed to relax their hold on me, as if giving me permission to turn and run, to escape the destiny that had befallen so many of them. I stepped backward, my heart in pieces, my vision blurred through welling tears. Max, we have to go, Ella said, tugging me back, her voice urgent, her face streaked with tears. I spun, my chest constricted, the weight of the forest weighing in, compelling me onward. Jess's face dissolved to shadow, her form melting with the dark, primeval power that had taken her. The chanting built to a frenzied crescendo, and the last thing I saw before the darkness devoured her utterly was Jess's face serene and resolute, her eyes fastened on mine. Then she was gone. Ella and I tumbled rearward through the forest, down a path that seemed to open for us, as though the forest was offering one final courtesy. We ran, our breathing ragged, the weight of Jess's sacrifice treading heavy upon us with every step. The trees seemed to open up as the forest tumbled around us, giving us the final directions toward the trailhead. We didn't stop running, we didn't look back until we broke free from the edge of the forest, careening into the world so bright and untouched around us, all full of open air. I fell to the ground, the enormity of it all crashing over me like a wave. Ella dropped beside me, her face white, her eyes stricken, as if she were still caught within the forest's grasp. But as I turned back toward the line of trees, the shadows gathering far away, I knew we didn't really get away. Part of us of Jess would always remain there, held by something timeless, some inescapable will of the forest. And as we continued walking, our backs to Red Falls Forest, I knew that out there, it still waited, watching, waiting, ready for its next victim.